The darkest thing about Ice Age survival is not that life was cold. It is that survival often required people to become technically intimate with hunger, decay, broken bone, and death in ways that modern life has almost completely hidden. If you imagine prehistoric humans as noble, simple hunters living close to nature, this subject will feel like a slap. The archaeological record shows something harder and more disturbing. Marrow cracked out of shattered bones, grease rendered from smashed carcasses, possible controlled putrefaction, maggot-rich food hypotheses, and, in some places, human cannibalism combined with mortuary ritual. The truth is not just brutal, it is brutally efficient. The first thing to understand is that meat alone was not enough. A recent major study on Neanderthal bone grease processing explained a problem that sounds strange until you think about survival biology. Humans can only metabolize a limited amount of protein. If the diet contains too much lean animal protein without enough fat or carbohydrate, it can produce a debilitating and even lethal condition historically called rabbit starvation. That means Ice Age hunters could not simply celebrate a big kill and assume they were safe. Lean muscle was not the whole prize. Fat was the prize inside the prize. That single fact changes the mood of the entire story. When you hear that ancient people smashed bones open, the modern mind often imagines primitive savagery or emergency desperation. The more accurate interpretation is often calculated nutrition. Marrow, grease, organ fat, brains, and other lipid-rich tissues mattered because they prevented a diet from becoming metabolically dangerous. In a harsh environment, fat was not a luxury item. It was the difference between eating and actually being nourished. So the prehistoric question was not simply, do we have meat? It was, do we have enough fat to survive on this meat? One of the strongest pieces of evidence for that grim arithmetic is the 125,000-year-old Neanderthal so-called fat factory at Neumark Nord in Germany. Archaeologists reported that at least 102 large mammals were processed at a waterside location where partial carcasses were transported for systematic extraction of within-bone nutrients, especially grease. The site yielded more than 118,000 faunal remains, extensive cut marks, hammerstone damage, anvils, hammerstones, and heat-affected bones suggesting high-intensity processing. That is not casual hunting debris. It is organized calorie extraction on a scale large enough to look almost industrial by Paleolithic standards. Think about what the term fat factory really means. It means Neanderthals were not just killing animals and eating the obvious parts. They were breaking the entire carcass down with planning and repetition, hauling selected parts to a specific place, smashing bones, heating them, and extracting hidden calories from tissues modern supermarket culture barely remembers. The dark detail here is not only the violence of the process, it is the mindset. A dead animal was not dinner. It was a puzzle of nutrients, labor, time pressure, and spoilage risk. Summer did not necessarily make that easier. Modern people hear Ice Age summer and imagine relief after winter. Archaeologically, warmer periods could create a different kind of stress. Heat meant carcasses spoiled faster. Flies arrived faster. The race between abundance and microbial decay became more urgent. A successful hunt near water in a warm season could produce a huge volume of edible material and an equally huge labor emergency. Butchering, transporting, separating, breaking, heating, and preserving all had to happen before the kill turned from bounty into waste. In that sense, summer abundance could be terrifying because it forced people to process wealth before rot erased it. This is where the rotten meat question becomes more than clickbait. A 2025 study on Neanderthal diet did not directly prove that Neanderthals regularly ate rotten meat and maggots. What it did do was propose a serious explanation for puzzling nitrogen isotope values in late Pleistocene hominin remains. The researchers showed that fly larvae feeding on putrefying tissue can become extremely enriched in nitrogen isotopes, much more than the decomposing muscle itself. They argued that regular consumption of maggot-rich putrefied animal foods from caches may help explain why some Neanderthal isotope signatures look almost too carnivorous to be comfortably explained by fresh lean meat alone. That finding needs careful handling. The researchers were explicit that the hypothesis is exploratory, not final proof. Sample sizes were limited. Experimental conditions did not perfectly recreate late Pleistocene Europe, and not every preservation method used by ancient humans was modeled. So the responsible claim is not Neanderthals definitely ate rotten meat and maggots to survive. The responsible claim is that controlled putrefaction and consumption of insect-rich stored meat is now a credible scientific hypothesis supported by isotope experiments and ethnographic parallels from northern foragers In other words, some of the most disgusting food imaginable may also have been one of the smartest survival technologies available. That idea becomes less strange when you see it through preservation rather than disgust. A major synthesis on prehistoric fermentation and delayed return economies argued that drying, fermenting, and storing seasonal surpluses likely helped prehistoric people buffer risk long before agriculture. The article discussed evidence that putrefied meat and fish may have mattered in northern forager diets because controlled decomposition can preserve food, pre-digest proteins and fats, and turn seasonal abundance into later survival. Read that again. Rot, properly managed, may not have been the opposite of food preservation. It may have been food preservation. This flips a modern instinct upside down. Today, rot signals danger and waste. In some prehistoric contexts, controlled rot may have signaled strategy. If a warm season hunt produced more animal food than could be eaten immediately, the real challenge was not just consumption, it was transformation. Dry some of it, ferment some of it, cache some of it. Let insects get into some of it if the nutritional payoff later remains worth the revulsion now. The line between rotten and preserved is culturally and technically thinner than modern packaging has taught us. Another strong dark theme is cannibalism, and here the evidence at specific sites becomes unusually direct. Gofza Cave in Somerset, dated to about 14,700 calibrated years before present, preserves some of the clearest evidence of late Upper Paleolithic human cannibalism in Europe. Analyses found cut marks on more than 65% of human bones, including marks from disarticulation, scalping, and filleting. About 35% of the human bones show percussion damage consistent with marrow and grease extraction. Human tooth marks occur on dozens of fragments. Some skulls were deliberately modified into skull cups. One engraved human radius appears to have been incised as part of a larger cannibalistic mortuary process. That is not the archaeological signature of one body treated carelessly by scavengers. It is a patterned behavior. Bodies were processed in ways recognizably similar to animal carcasses, and the skulls were not just opened. Some were reshaped into objects. The radius with engraving adds another layer because it suggests that cutting into human remains was not only practical, it could also be symbolic. Archaeologists interpret Gof's Cave as showing a combination of nutritional cannibalism and ritual behavior. The darkest part of that sentence is not just the cannibalism. It is the word combination. Why does that matter so much? Because it destroys the comforting idea that cannibalism appears only when people are one day from death. At Gof's Cave, the evidence does not simply point to wild desperation. It points to structured mortuary practice that included consumption and modification of bodies. In that world, food processing, funerary treatment, symbolism, and social ritual may have overlapped far more than modern people want to imagine. The Ice Age was not just physically distant from us. In some practices, it was psychologically distant too. The labor behind all of this was its own form of brutality. Processing a large animal without metal tools, refrigeration, plastic containers, or mechanized transport was exhausting. Carcasses had to be dismembered. Useful parts had to be selected and moved. Bones had to be broken with stones. Grease had to be rendered from fragments. Hides had to be worked. Brains and organ tissues had to be claimed before spoilage. Every stage cost time and energy, and every hour of delay increased loss. Even success could be punishing. A big kill did not end the problem. It created a mountain of urgent work. That work was also dangerous. Late Ice Age groups commonly pursued large animals such as horse, reindeer, bison, aurochs, and, in earlier periods, mammoth. Hunting these animals at close range with thrusting weapons, traps, or coordinated drives carried obvious injury risk. Warm season and shoulder season hunting near water, marshes, or migration bottlenecks may have been productive, but productivity came with proximity. A panicked large herbivore can break limbs, crush bodies, and turn a successful hunt into a funeral. So even before the carcass reached the processing site, survival was already demanding that humans gamble their own bodies against large animal force. The most unsettling insight may be how rational the whole system was. Broken bones at extraction sites are not random violence. They are nutritional logic made visible. Putrefaction is not simply neglect. It may be controlled storage under prehistoric constraints. Cannibalized remains are not always evidence of mindless savagery. They may reflect a mortuary system in which practical consumption and symbolic treatment occupied the same space. Once you accept that, the Ice Age looks less like primitive chaos and more like a harsh technical culture built around recurring problems of energy, fat, timing, and death. Seasonality deepens that picture. Some Magdalenian cave occupations appear brief and repeated, possibly connected to targeted seasonal exploitation. At Gough's Cave, the occupation seems to have taken place over a short span, perhaps only a few generations, with repeated treatment patterns. Repetition matters because it points to learned behavior, not one-off panic. When the same processing marks, the same kinds of breakage, and the same skull modifications recur, the behavior begins to look normal within that cultural setting. Dark practices become ordinary when they reliably solve the same problem over and over. The language of survival can hide that horror by sounding heroic, saying prehistoric people used every part of the animal sounds respectful and efficient. What it often meant in practice was smashing long bones, boiling or heating fragments, stripping tissue meticulously, and treating a carcass as a container of trapped calories that had to be forced out before microbes, scavengers, or time claimed them first. A modern kitchen makes nutrition look clean. Prehistoric nutrition often looked like impact, damage, and grease stains. And remember the rabbit starvation point, because it links almost everything. If protein-heavy lean meat can become dangerous without enough fat or carbohydrate, then marrow and grease move from bonus calories to priority calories. The fat factory at Newmark Nord starts to make more sense. So does the possibility of preserving food in ways that maintained access to nutrients over time. So does the relentless attention to bones rather than just flesh. Ice Age people were not obsessed with bones because they were crude. They were obsessed with bones because bones hid the energy that kept the rest of the diet from becoming a trap. This also helps explain why summer could be dark in a very specific way. A successful warm season kill might produce an overwhelming glut of lean tissue that could not simply be left to nature until tomorrow. Heat, insects, and bacteria would move first. Hunters therefore faced a grim calculation: process immediately, preserve aggressively, or lose a hard-won opportunity. In that context, even controlled putrefaction stops sounding like a horror movie detail and starts sounding like an answer to a scheduling crisis. If decay is unavoidable, the smartest move may be to manage it instead of pretending you can stop it. The cannibalism evidence adds an even more intimate layer to this idea of efficiency. At Gough's Cave, more than 65% of the human bones carried cut marks, and about 35% showed percussion damage consistent with marrow and grease extraction. Human tooth marks appeared on dozens of fragments. Those figures tell us that once the body entered that mortuary process, it was not being touched lightly. It was being opened, reduced, and used in ways structurally similar to other carcass processing. For modern viewers, that is often the emotional point of no return. It is where the word survival becomes impossible to romanticize. Yet even there, the evidence resists a simple monster story. Skull cups and the engraved radius suggest meaning as well as nutrition. The dead were not only consumed, they were transformed. That combination may be more disturbing than pure starvation cannibalism because it suggests a worldview in which the body could remain socially active after death through rituals that included cutting, drinking, memory, and possibly ingestion. The Ice Age was not merely hard. It could also be symbolically complex in ways that feel alien now. Another dark truth is that we may still be underestimating how much of prehistoric intelligence went into food storage rather than food capture. Big game hunting attracts attention because it is dramatic. But the archaeological and theoretical work on fermentation and delayed return economies suggests that what happened after the hunt may have mattered just as much. Drying, storing, fermenting, and perhaps allowing certain foods to putrefy under controlled conditions could turn short windows of abundance into later survival. The hero move may not have been the kill. It may have been the management of what the kill became over the next days and weeks. So if we ask what the darkest things humans did to survive an Ice Age summer were, the evidence-backed list is already grim enough. They smashed bones for marrow and grease because protein alone could kill them. They hauled carcass parts to special extraction sites and reduced them to fragments for hidden calories. They may have stored meat in ways that encouraged controlled putrefaction and insect colonization. They may have eaten maggot-rich or fermented animal foods because those foods preserved nutrients and stretched seasonal abundance. In at least some contexts, they processed human bodies, extracted nutrition from them, reshaped skulls into cups, and engraved human bone as part of a mortuary system. The strongest caveat is that not every grisly act was caused by one hard summer and not every act was simple desperation. Some behaviors were nutritional strategy, some were preservation technology, some were culturally meaningful ritual, some were probably all three at once. That caveat matters because it keeps the story honest. The Ice Age does not need exaggeration. The record already shows a world where survival could mean becoming intimate with decay and mechanically efficient with death. And that may be the most unsettling conclusion of all. Ice Age survival was not noble simplicity. It was technical, exhausting, embodied, and sometimes horrifyingly clever. The people who endured it were not merely tougher than we are. They were forced to understand food, fat, spoilage, and mortality at a level of physical realism that modern abundance has allowed us to forget. If you want the follow-up video, it has to be the one on the smartest Ice Age survival technologies, because the line between genius and horror in this world is almost impossible to separate. It helps to imagine one successful hunting event in slow motion. A large animal is finally down near water during a warm phase. Relief lasts only a moment. The group now faces a different emergency. Flesh must be stripped before spoilage accelerates. The richest parts may need to be eaten first. Heavy sections have to be transported or processed on site. Long bones cannot just be discarded because the hidden marrow and later grease matter nutritionally. Fires, stone tools, hammerstones, and labor all need coordination. In a modern fridge world, abundance means security. In an Ice Age summer without refrigeration, abundance could mean a countdown. The Neumark Nord site is so powerful because it captures that countdown in physical debris. At least 72 large mammals, more than 118,000 faunal remains, cut marks, hammerstone damage, anvils, hammerstones, and heat-affected bones together point to repeated, organized extraction. This was not a one-time frenzy. It was a known procedure. The site shows that hidden calories inside bones were worth building a whole processing pattern around. That tells us something profound about Ice Age intelligence. People were not only reading landscapes and tracking animals, they were also reading carcasses as storage systems full of delayed energy. The preservation angle becomes even more credible when you stop treating disgust as a universal guide. Controlled fermentation already exists in many food traditions. Ethnographic parallels from northern foragers show that allowing certain animal foods to decompose in managed ways can be practical rather than pathological. The 2025 isotope work on fly larvae and putrefying tissue does not prove every Neanderthal cache was crawling with maggots, but it gives a plausible biochemical route by which decomposed animal foods could contribute unusually enriched nitrogen signals. That is exactly the sort of clue archaeology often depends on. Not a perfect direct witness, but a pattern suddenly explained by behavior that modern audiences instinctively reject. There is also a psychological challenge in understanding ancient efficiency. Modern people like to rank survival actions morally, with ordinary eating on one end and cannibalism on the far end. Archaeology sometimes forces a less comfortable view. Once a body, animal or human, enters a system shaped by caloric need, ritual practice, and technical knowledge, the processing marks can start to look disturbingly similar. Cut marks, percussion damage, marrow extraction, and reshaping of bone all belong to procedures rather than to our preferred emotional categories. That is why Gough's Cave remains so haunting. It is not only that humans ate humans, it is that they did so with patterned methods visible in percentages. More than 65% of bones cut marked, about 35% percussion damaged, dozens of fragments bearing human tooth marks. The skull cups at Gough's Cave force one more difficult thought. Turning human skulls into cups is not just consumption, it is transformation. It suggests that the dead could remain present in social life through objects made from their remains. The engraved human radius pushes the same direction. These are signs that survival, memory, and symbolism could overlap in one mortuary sequence. That overlap matters because it means some of the darkest behaviors may have felt orderly, meaningful, and even proper to the people doing them. And all of this circles back to labor. When researchers describe processing, extraction, rendering, and preservation, the words can sound clinical. The lived reality was closer to relentless manual work under pressure, stone on bone, heat on fragments, tissue stripped before flies and bacteria won, repeated hauling, repeated cracking, repeated sorting. It is one thing to say ancient people used every part of the animal. It is another to understand that using every part demanded skill, time, physical punishment, and a willingness to stay close to blood, smell, and decay for long periods. This is why the Ice Age summer may have contained its own special darkness. Winter threatens through scarcity. Summer can threaten through management failure. If you miss a hunt in winter, you have little. If you succeed in summer and fail to preserve or fully process it, you still end up with little, only now after enormous effort and waste. The warm season therefore did not erase fear. It changed the shape of fear from not finding food to not saving food in time. The cleanest final lesson is that prehistoric survival was highly engineered with the materials available. Hammerstones, anvils, fire, cut marks, caches, fermentation or putrefaction strategies, selective transport of carcass parts, and repeated seasonal occupations all point to systems rather than improvisation. The systems just happen to operate very close to things modern humans find revolting. That is what makes the subject so powerful. The same behavior can look like horror from the outside and intelligence from the inside. So when people talk about the darkest things humans did to survive, the strongest evidence does not ask us to imagine fantasy cruelty. It asks us to face practical cruelty to animals, practical indifference to decomposition, practical use of human remains in some contexts, and practical obsession with fat, because protein-heavy meat without it could become a deadly mistake. The Ice Age was not merely a colder version of life. It was a world where efficiency and revulsion could occupy the same toolkit at the very same fire every night.